Hello, my name is Dr. Joseph Piacentile. I'm a medical doctor and I'm a lawyer, a practicing lawyer. I've been involved in whistleblower cases for 30 years as a whistleblower, then as a consultant, and then as an attorney. Most of my cases have been in healthcare, and we're here today to talk with Dr. Robert E. Lee. He's a medical doctor. He's a vascular surgeon of many years. He'll explain his background. And most recently, he spent the last 10 years at the FDA. Bob is coming forward. Dr. Lee is coming forward because of a very concerning issue. The FDA recently, December 19th of 2024, approved a vascular graft called the CIMVAS graft by a corporation, Humacyte Corporation. This graft has been in development for years. Dr. Lee will explain the situation. The FDA approved this graft, and this graft is intended to be used in our soldiers. This is a vascular graft used to repair arteries in the body, particularly in the case of trauma where the artery is ripped or damaged. The graft was tested using Ukrainian soldiers and other people. It went through the typical studies that you do for a product like this, and no less than 3 vascular surgeons who work for the FDA failed the product and had major concerns with the product. And did not want this product to be approved without a hearing, a public hearing, which is the norm for the FDA to have public hearings whenever the clinical folks at the FDA have a problem with a product, and then the FDA administrators want to approve the product. There's a hearing so that the public will know what's going on and what the concerns of the doctors were. In this case, the FDA ignored and overrode the concerns of their own physicians, the 3 vascular surgeons, went to 3 outside but unnamed FDA consultant vascular surgeons, and implied in their letter that these other 3, the second group of vascular surgeons, also approved the product, and therefore the FDA went forward and gave the product the biological license approval on December 19th. The problem is that one of those anonymous doctors came forward and he said that he never approved the product, and he was surprised that the FDA had approved the product anyway. The problem is this. This product is intended for use in our soldiers. This product was used on Ukrainian soldiers in the battlefield, amongst other patients. This product had catastrophic failures. This product is dangerous. This product should not be on the market, not without further testing, and certainly not without hearings. And for some reason, this product has been pushed through, and the FDA bypassed all the conventions of public hearings to put this product through. And Dr. Lee, and I'll let him explain it in his own words, in good conscience, has decided to come forward and tell the public as a warning. This is a warning to the new chairman of the FDA, Dr. Makary, and to the new Secretary of Defense, Mr. Hegseth, that this product, which was funded in part with millions of dollars from the Department of Defense, hundreds of millions of dollars from the public. This is a public company, a recently gone public company, and there are problems. There are many problems. And you'll hear the story from Dr. Lee that the people inside the company, doctors inside the company, also left the company before it became public because of issues. And they're concerned about this product. So there are no less than 4 vascular surgeons that we're aware of who worked with the FDA, who did not want to approve this product. The product was approved anyway. The company is intending to now market this product It'll go into hospitals all around the country, all around the world. It'll be used by soldiers and veterans, and there have been catastrophic failures with this product. There's one horror story where a patient was operated on in their bed because there was no time to take the patient to the operating room. Dr. Lee will tell you these stories. And out of good conscience, Dr. Lee is coming forward. So with that said, I'd like to introduce Dr. Robert E. Lee. He's a medical doc and a vascular surgeon. Good morning, Dr. Lee.
Good morning.
Dr. Lee, can you just tell us a little bit about your background, just so we know where you went to school, where you went to college, medical school? Tell me what your career has been.
Sure. I'll start out from the beginning. I'm a native of Detroit, Michigan. Part of my concern here arises from the fact that my dad was a military man. He went into the Korean War era out of high school as a grunt or enlisted man, did well. They sent him to OCS. He came out proud lieutenant, and he served in the reserves for another 15 years before he retired as a major. And he taught me immense respect for our military. And the most important thing my dad taught me was this. One day while we were watching the Army-Navy game, he told me, those guys in the long gray line were the greatest leaders I ever served under. And you know the first thing they taught me in officers candidate school? And I said, what, Dad? Shoot a gun, launch a cannon, what? He said, they taught me, in the Army, we do not lie, cheat, steal, or tolerate those people that do. And it's that fundamental moral background that causes me to come forth and speak out about what happened in FDA during my tenure there. As far as my clinical background, I went to undergrad school at the University of Michigan. I had pretty good grades. I got into medical school there after my junior year. I had an early interest in vascular surgery, and was fortunate that Henry Ford Hospital was affiliated with Michigan at that time. That is one of the places where the discipline of vascular surgery was launched in America by my mentor, Dr. Emmerich Szilagyi, who commercialized the first Dacron vascular graft back in the late 50s and 60s. And I went there for my 5 years of general surgery training, as well as my vascular surgery fellowship. And during that period of time, I spent some time in the lab implanting experimental vascular grafts. And so I had a good handle on medical devices from my training. And I was also trained by a guy, Dr. Szilagyi, who was termed the conscience of vascular surgery because of his severe honesty and the fact that every statement he made in publishing the results of his pioneering work was backed up by solid scientific data. And one thing that my mentor, Dr. Szilagyi, taught me that stayed with me during my period of time as a regulator was the sentence I heard him say many times to many residents over a period of almost 8 years I spent there as a medical student and in training. He said, think twice before you put a prosthetic vascular device into a patient, because you're going to change their future forever. And I think he would have a sterner warning today for biologic products that are less stable than manufactured graft. But after I finished my training at Henry Ford Hospital, I spent some years in academic practice at Wayne State University, but spent the bulk of my career in private practice, practicing exclusively vascular and endovascular surgery in Southeast Michigan for about 30 years. And towards the end of 2014, when my hospital got taken over by a for-profit corporation, I really wasn't anxious to go elsewhere and start over. And I happened to be in my office reading one of the medical journals, and it said, FDA desperately needs experienced vascular surgeon to assist with review of medical devices. So I called FDA and told them my background. They invited me to come down for an interview. They liked the fact that I had done vascular research and knew about graft healing and incorporation. And they offered me a job on the vascular and endovascular devices team, which is the team that has been responsible for approving all vascular grafts since the medical device amendments were passed in 1976 that gave the FDA the authority to regulate medical devices. And I joined the vascular and endovascular devices team in the Office of Cardiovascular Devices in the Center for Devices and Radiologic Health in January of 2015 and spent there 10 years as a regulator of vascular surgical devices before I decided to retire in late September of 2024. So that gives you an idea of my background. I was involved heavily in administration, serving as chief of surgery in several of the hospitals I practiced at, and also stayed active during my career in a large variety of professional societies.
Okay. So you started with, it's amazing background, and you left your hospital because it was taken over by a for-profit entity. And you decided then to go serve in the government for 10 years almost, from January of 15 to recently, December to September of 24. And while you were there, what was your job there? Can you just explain briefly what a vascular graft is?
Sure.
I think some people get confused. They think of a graft, they think of skin grafts, or they think of something like a cardiac stent. But a vascular graft is a little different, isn't it? So can you just explain to a layperson what a vascular graft is and why it's important that it must work properly?
A vascular graft is a tube-like structure that can be used to replace or repair blood vessels. And in the history of vascular surgery, uh, the most ideal, well-performing graft is a piece of autologous tissue from the patient's own body. Most commonly, the saphenous vein in your leg is utilized by the cardiac surgeons to repair your heart, used by us vascular surgeons to repair arteries and periphery. So autogenous grafts are the most durable, safe, and preferred option. But there are situations where autogenous tissue is not available. If people have had their veins harvested for prior heart surgery or previous leg bypass surgery, or
You're saying use the safest thing is to use the patient's own tissue, a vein perhaps, or some other tissue to actually make this tubular graft. But if that's not necessary, then the industry goes to man-made grafts.
not possible, then man-made grafts are utilized. And as I said, the first generation of commercial grafts was developed by Dr. Salagi at Henry Ford. His first article beat Dr. DeBakey to the punch. But they use Dacron grafts, and those are still necessary to replace large arteries like the aorta or the iliac arteries, where there is not a harvestable vein that could be used. So
Dacron grafts have been used safely in vascular surgery for how many years now?
since the late 50s.
Since the late 50s. And now, in addition, there are other kinds of grafts. I believe Gore-Tex is one of them.
Gore-Tex was probably the next variety of prosthetic devices that came around. Gore-Tex is manufactured from polytetrafluoroethylene or plastic, and that's a graft that's commonly used in leg bypass surgery, dialysis graft surgery, and even in trauma surgery. It has a relatively reasonable success record.
And how long has Gore-Tex been used approximately?
I think the first Gore-Tex grafts came out in the early 1980s when I was a resident.
So for 40 years, those have been used fairly safely. And I believe that the Gore Medical is the manufacturer of that product.
They're one of many,
Right.
FE, the patent expired, and there's a lot of people making
A lot of people out there now.
grafts today.
So prior to the Humacyte Corporation's product, which I think they called a disruptive product, was their word. What is the standard What is the current standard?
There's one more category of grafts called biologic grafts, and human arteries from other people have been processed and are available, but don't have a great performance record. Grafts from bovine carotid arteries have been used successfully for dialysis grafts and another indications. So the third category would be biologic grafts. But the Humacyte product is the first of a kind, uh, lab developed graft where the company has a proprietary means of seeding a scaffold with vascular smooth muscle cells,
All right.
growing the product in the lab environment, decellularizing the process so it's not antigenic, and then transplanting the graft, which in the early studies they called it the HAV, the uh, Humacyte acellular vessel. Uh, Under the approval letter, it's now known as CIMVAS.
Well, let's stop there for a second before we get into that graft. Because I just want to finish up the first conversation
Sure.
where we talked about. So we had the original graft was what again? The original graft, the one that your doc worked on in Michigan.
Well, the original grafts were made out of Dacron.
Acron. Then they went to Gore-Tex,
Then they went Gore-Tex.
and
And
then they went to bovine. And would they use a cadaver graft when you said these organs from other
cadaver
people?
grafts are available. And really, in the first days of vascular surgeries in the early 50s, they used human homografts from, dead donors. But those biologic grafts deteriorated, and that's
Right.
why they recognized the founders of the discipline, DeBakey and Szilagyi, realized you needed a durable construct, and that's when the prosthetic grafts were developed.
So the biological grafts really, in your opinion, don't work as well as the manufactured grafts, as a Gore-Tex graft would.
It depends on the setting. There's a niche setting for some of the biologic grafts and dialysis access, and sometimes the homografts of human aortas are used in cases of infection. But the mainstream graft, if you go to the hospital for an elective operation and they can't use saphenous vein, a Dacron graft would be used, or a PTFE graft would
P-
be
And
standard.
PTFE, what is that, please?
Gore-Tex.
Gore-Tex. Okay, so so Dacron grafts and Gore-Tex grafts are still the mainstay of grafting in
For
vascular
elective
surgery.
surgery where the risk of infection are low, correct.
Correct. Okay. And in trauma, and you did a lot of trauma work, I'm
On
assuming.
streets of Detroit, it's one of the most violent, cities in America, and that's one of the things that attracted me to Henry Ford is you had a great spectrum of pathology from referred tertiary care cases to the off-the-street knife and gun club.
And let's just talk
Uh,
about that for a second. I want people to understand what happens in vascular trauma, the urgency of it. Someone is in a car accident, or in the case of a soldier, someone is shot or is hit with an IED and there's a piece of shrapnel. Something tears their artery. It could be blunt force trauma from a motor vehicle accident. It could be shrapnel. It could be a bullet, many things, right? And depending on which artery is compromised, what does that look like in the OR? What does that look like in the battlefield? I mean, how much time do you have to fix this patient and to go through a thought process in order to save the patient's life?
I mean, when there's loss of vascular continuity and arterial hemorrhage, it's a life and death situation. And, you know, l- hopefully, I mean, if the street warriors are lucky and they get shot, either their buddies take them to the hospital and have the foresight to put a tourniquet on and deliver them and dump them at the side door of the hospital, or EMS brings them in. Many times they're in shock. They need to be intubated. They may have associated injuries. There's usually not a lot of time to, think about things. You got to get that patient resuscitated into the operating room to stop the bleeding and to save the patient's life.
Right.
If the artery blocks off from trauma, it's still an urgent situation because, a limb can really only survive 5 or 6 hours without circulation before there's permanent damage, and
Right.
even less if that blocked artery is to the brain or to your gut.
So this is what you would,
whole situation with not a lot of time for, discussion or debating the options in most instances.
right. So this is what you would define as a classic surgical emergency.
As urgent and emergent as you will see in medicine.
Correct. All right. So now we know these are surgical emergencies. We know that the blood vessels are ripped or damaged, and someone like you, a vascular surgeon, has to open this patient up, get in, and repair the artery that's damaged. And the way you're going to do that is to either stitch the artery itself, if it's stitchable, if it's salvageable. But in many cases, you put this tubular graft over the artery. It's like a tube over a tube. And and that brings back competency to this tube, correct?
Yeah, if you can repair primarily a clean cut with some sutures, that's preferred. But when there's loss of continuity or significantly long segment of vessel that's damaged, you have to bring a new tube in, trim out or resect the damaged artery, and then sew the new tube in at both ends to restore vascular continuity and restore perfusion to the limb or the particular organ that's at risk.
Okay. So this is serious stuff. Tell us now, you were at the FDA. When did you first become aware of the Humacyte Corporation and the product that they had in front of the FDA for evaluation? They were doing a study, correct? Can you tell me when you first heard the name Humacyte and when you first came in contact with their product?
Yes, absolutely. It was very early in my career when I first got to FDA. And my boss at the time said, the biologics people have this product that they need help with. They don't have any surgeons over in the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research. So part of your job obligation, besides reviewing the devices that we review, is you're going to help CBER out on this product, which at the time was called the HAV.
Can you explain what CBER is, please? CBER?
CBER, that's the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research. It's one of the FDA centers. There's a Center for Devices, Center for Drugs, Center for Veterinary Products.
So it's a group within the FDA. You call it a center.
Correct.
But it's actually a group of people within the FDA.
Right. They have purview over approving biologic products like vaccines, gene therapy. And because this particular product from Humacyte was biologically derived in the lab, the FDA decided that CBER would have purview and be the primary center responsible for approving the Humacyte different biologic license application.
Right. But then CBER really didn't have any vascular surgeons, so they asked you to help CBER make the evaluation of these products.
That is correct, sir.
And when was that approximately?
Oh, that was probably early in 2015, shortly after my arrival there.
Okay, so you can say since 2015 all the way up through 2024, you've been working on and you've been watching the development of all the studies going into the Humacyte product, which I believe is called the CIMVAS product. CIMVAS.
That was the trade name that it was given at the time of the FDA approval of the biologic license application, or BLA, in December.
It's called a CIMVAS graft.
Yeah. During the trial periods, it was called the HAV for short.
HAV, and now it's got a trade name, CIMVAS, SYMVESS, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And this is the graft that was approved on December 19th of 24.
Yes, that is when it was approved for the indication of use in trauma surgery when saphenous vein was not available.
Okay. Let's talk about this product. And you started with it, and so you have 9 years experience on the FDI side working with this product. Now, were you alone, or did you work with other vascular doctors? Were there two other doctors as well as you that also evaluated this product?
Yeah, I was the primary liaison that worked with CBER over that period of time, during which I believe 7 or 8 of the CBER medical officers rotated on and off of the device team. But I was the only vascular surgeon over that 9.5-year period of continuity working with the Center for Biology. Over time, I gained 2 associates about 5 years back who were both distinguished vascular surgeons in their own right. One came from the military, one came from academia. And
Can you
so,
explain their backgrounds briefly? You said one of those vascular surgeons came from the military. Can you just give me an idea of his background, please?
yes, he was a career military surgeon, went into the military in medical school, did his training, trained originally as a general surgeon. Then when the war on terror broke out, the military realized all their people at the front lines had to be vascular capable. So he went back and got additional training in vascular surgery. He served, I believe, 2 tours of duty in the war on terror, fixing people up on the front lines. After that, he came to Walter Reed Hospital, where he became the chief of vascular surgery. And when his 30 years in the military were up, we were fortunate that he decided to join our vascular and endovascular devices team at FDA.
And when did he join you at FDA approximately?
I would say roughly about 5 years ago.
5 years ago? Okay. And then you said there was another doc there, another vascular surgeon came from the academic world?
Yes, we were very fortunate to get one of the most prominent academic vascular surgeons in the country who served as chair of one of the most renowned academic vascular programs in the country. He's a very experienced clinical trialist who participated as investigator or principal investigator in multiple device trials. He served as recent past president of the Society for Vascular Surgery, which is the most preeminent organization of vascular surgery that there is. So I had 2 extremely competent guys that rounded out the picture of one guy from military medicine, one guy from academic medicine, one guy who spent the bulk of his career, other than a short period of academia, in private practice. So we had all the bases covered. And
All right. And then it was the job of the 3 of you to evaluate this Humacyte product and make your recommendations to the CBER group at the FDA.
well,
As-
let me back up just a brief second. My job was the primary liaison, and
Mm.
I worked with CBER over that 9.5-year period. And, initially the company had trials of their product for several other indications. One was using it in leg bypass surgery. One was using it for dialysis grafts for the people that need to get placed on hemodialysis. They need to have a blood access route. Uh, but over time, it became clear that probably their quickest pathway to get a BLA would be to focus on the trauma indication. And so that's how I became involved with the trauma studies that the company submitted to FDA to get the trauma approval.
And just to
Now,
remind everybody, a BLA is a biological license application.
BLA is biological license application, correct?
And those are specific for the type of injury you want to treat or
Well,
the
indicate-
particular use. So
Correct.
if you're going, you would need a BLA, let's say, for a stent or a shunt that you would put in for a dialysis patient, and you would need a different BLA if you're looking for a trauma indication, correct?
And a different one if you're using it for blocked arteries in the leg. Yeah, correct, sir. Mhm.
So they focused on the BLA for trauma.
That was their recent focus over the last few years, correct.
Okay.
And I was the primary, liaison there. But when I ran into problematic cases, us medical officers would meet weekly, and I would present the problematic cases to my peers and say, I want to make sure I'm interpreting this right. Do you agree this was a problematic case?
So the flow of information would be that the company was doing clinical studies. That means they're putting these devices in patients as a study in cooperation with the FDA, the full knowledge of the FDA, to test out new products. as those products were being put in, those patient charts would be created, and then you would be made aware of what was going on with those patients and what the outcomes were. That was your job.
It wasn't simple. Let me say that over the period of my, 9.5 years working with CBER, a few years ago, there was a radical change in that the center underwent a reorganization. And the original heads of the office that I was working with there, uh, the director and his right-hand man, were consummate professionals who treated me as a member of their team, who interacted with me frequently, who would call me before and after meetings to find out my way of thinking or to see whether what they were going to approach the company with in terms of recommendations, fit with the vascular surgical science. But a few years ago, there was a complete reorganization of CBER. Those experienced medical officers decided to leave for whatever reason. And with the new leadership at CBER, I wasn't brought in to look at the Humacyte trauma data until the BLA was submitted. I wasn't privy to getting any progress reports, in which case I might have had issues when disruptions were starting to be seen. When we monitored,
When did that change take place, Dr. Lee?
I think it was about 3 years ago.
So 3 years ago, instead of being involved in the process on a real-time basis, you were getting all your information after the fact.
Well, when the Humacyte trauma files came in, I was not even contacted by management. I was called by their most junior medical officer who told me, Bob, I know you've worked with the team in the past. I'm a pediatric pulmonologist, but I've been given this file and I don't know what's right or wrong in terms of adverse events or outcomes with vascular surgery. I'm going to need to depend on you to go through every clinical case report, study it, tell me whether the adverse outcomes that were observed were something that was expected. Were they unexpected devices? Were they or unexpected events related to the biologic product? I can't do this on my own because I don't have that background.
Right. So what you're saying is that the lead physician who is given the authority as to whether these products get approved was a pediatrician.
Authority, but he was given the primary responsibility of being the medical officer.
And he was a pediatric pulmonary doctor, which means he treats lung diseases, asthma in children and things like that.
That was his background. Yes, sir.
He wasn't a surgeon.
He was not a surgeon.
And he wasn't a trauma surgeon.
He was not a trauma or a vascular surgeon.
And he's dealing with childhood asthma for the most part and childhood breathing problems. So he calls you and says, look, I need help here. And you had been helping on a proactive basis, but 3 years ago, they changed the methodology. And now you're getting your information after the fact. So you're getting medical records after the patients have already been implanted with the device. And then you're seeing the results later.
I got over 2,300 pages of clinical records on the 86 or so patients that were treated.
Yes. All right. So let's focus in on this because this is where we're down to the meat and potatoes here, right? We're right down to the meat here. 86 patients in a study. You're getting the paperwork on these 86 patients. It's 2,300 pages.
Yeah.
And your job,
mm-hmm.
and correct me if I'm wrong, but it's your job as a trained vascular surgeon with years of experience to go through those pages. Now, as you're going through those case studies, what input did the other two vascular surgeons you told us about, did they have?
When there were problematic cases, I would take them to our weekly review sessions. The three of us met every week.
Every week.
Go over our problematic files and run cases by each other and say, am I looking at this right? So when there were problems with the patients in the Humacyte trauma study, I would review them with my new colleagues to make sure that they were on the same page as me.
Okay, so what you're about to share with us, which you came to me initially, which is tremendously concerning and troubling and actually scary and sad in a way. pediatrician in charge had the foresight and the good sense to say, this is over my head. I am not qualified. So he calls you and says, Bob, will you help me? You helped in the past. Can you evaluate this? And you had weekly meetings with these other two preeminent doctors. One is a two-time veteran of a foreign war for the United States, a soldier's doctor, right? And the other one is a preeminent academician, head of the Vascular Society. So you got three pretty bright guys looking at these 2,600 pages.
They didn't look at all 2,600 pages. They vetted the problematic cases I brought.
Right. You were the lead, you were the point man, and then
this catastrophic outcome or this death is related to the Humacyte graft itself.
Did people die from this graft?
There was one catastrophic death that occurred in a patient. Yes, sir.
All right. Now, when we talked prior, you were telling me that there were initially 86 patients that were studied. And then at one point, the 86 patients, 35 of those charts were removed or redacted by the FDA. And then it was cut down to 50 patients.
Well, they weren't really redacted. In Humacyte treated patients, there were 17 patients treated in the Ukraine where they sent the device over to the Ukraine, and we can talk about them more in depth in a minute. And then there was a U.S. trauma study done at U.S. trauma centers where they subdivided the patients into two groups or two cohorts. One cohort was patients where the Humacyte graft was placed in the arm or the leg for extremity injuries. The other one was when it was placed in the chest or in the abdomen for truncal injuries.
Okay.
So the approval for use in vascular trauma of the extremities is based on the analysis of that subgroup of 51 extremity cases, focused in on them, not talking about the performance in the other patients that were treated in the chest or the abdomen. So that's how it got narrowed down to 51. They're just looking at outcomes in extremity patients, and the approval is for extremity trauma only.
Now, the 17 Ukrainians, was this used in the trunk or was this used in the extremities?
It was used in the extremities, but I have to say, you know, if you look at the scope of the Ukraine war, and you know, President Zelensky has cited these figures publicly. There are 46,000 dead Ukraine soldiers. There's 390,000 wounded soldiers in the Ukraine. Yet from that breadth of trauma experience, the Humacyte graft was only used in 16 highly selected patients that had isolated, for the most part, isolated limb injuries. And they were stable enough to be treated some days to some weeks after the injuries. I've heard Ukrainian surgeons speak at our U.S. surgical meetings. They are not treating the same devastating multi-trauma patients that our military surgeons are called upon to manage right up at the front lines. They can't offer such treatment due to two things, both resource issues and the fact that the Red Cross has documented that the Russians target medical personnel, medical tents with the Red Cross on it, and there's snipers out trying to shoot Ukrainian surgeons, or they're bombing Ukrainian forward medical centers. So the 17 patients that got treated had less severe injuries than I would expect our surgeons are going to be called upon to treat in the next military conflagration. And if a device is not tested in the same severity of injury patients or the same population that it's going to use, it may not represent the outcomes in those patients. And I have a grave concern that the limited injuries treated in the Ukrainian study will underestimate the severity of the safety problems if this product is used in more severely injured limbs and severely injured patients by our military surgeons.
All right. Dr. Lee, let me just ask this. Is it correct to say that you, after looking at all the data and after meeting on a weekly basis with the other two vascular surgeons, had very strong feelings that this product wasn't safe, and you had asked for hearings about the product, and the FDA for many years had a tradition and a practice of having open hearings to discuss products when there's an argument or a disagreement amongst the professionals within the FDA as to the safety of a product. And I understand in this particular product, there were no hearings held. Is that true?
That is true. Yeah, let me go back to how the review process went once I was given the 2,300 plus pages of information.
Absolutely.
By CBER. There were 4 cohorts of patients, 3 groups from the U.S. trauma study, 1 group from the Ukrainian study. I would take each cohort, review the individual cases, fill out a detailed analysis sheet for each patient, just like I would as chief of surgery, reviewing complications for our surgical morbidity and mortality conferences. I would share the problematic cases and vet them with my fellow medical officers. And then I would return each cohort of cases to the CBER medical officers to pass on to their management. After I got done with all 4 cohorts of patients and had analyzed the outcomes in the 86 patients, I drafted a summary consult form that was reviewed by my superiors in the Center for Devices and Radiologic Health. And in that summary, I indicated grave concern about the rate of ruptures that were observed in the 86 patients treated in the Humacyte trauma studies. Of those 86 patients, 8 of them, or 9.3% of the treated population, developed catastrophic, sudden, unexpected, life-threatening bleeds, which led to 1 death and needed emergency reoperations in all the patients, sometimes multiple reinterventions. This is gravely concerning. It's concerning because there was no warning in many of these patients. It's concerning because of the magnitude of the hemorrhage. And this is a life-threatening problem, which was seen with an unacceptable frequency.
Now you're saying almost 10%. What is the normal failure rate that's established after 20 years of use on a Gore-Tex graft or a current graft that's currently used in the market?
You know, it varies from study to study, but probably the most famous paper on the use of Gore-Tex grafts in trauma came out of the Ben Taub Trauma Center in Houston. And they said they never saw a serious infection leading to disruption of the graft unless the patient had osteomyelitis, a bone infection, or severe loss of coverage over the graft.
So you're saying it's rare, less than 1%?
Not rare, but it's not in the 10% range of these life-threatening, sudden, catastrophic bleeds.
But what range would it be in?
You know, it's going to vary, but I'll say this. When PTFE gets infected, as a rule, it's uncommon for it to develop a sudden devastating bleed. Those patients have redness of the wound. They have pus draining out of the wound. They have tenderness over the wound. They have positive blood cultures. They have fever. They appear sick. There's a warning that the surgeon has that something bad is going on, and you better intervene on that infected graft before there's a catastrophe and it disconnects from the patient's own artery.
And those are the current grafts that are in use in the market.
Those are the current ones.
Is the Gore-Tex graft?
They're the current ones that would be used when saphenous vein is not available.
Right, but that's the current state of the art of the industry.
That's the current option for trauma.
Right, but with the Humacyte graft, tell us what happens.
I mean, these were sudden catastrophic episodes. One poor fella ruptured at home on Christmas Day, and he got transferred to another hospital that wasn't the trauma center. Uh, Fortunately, there was a temporary sealing of the rupture, but the community hospital was smart enough to say, you need to go back to the trauma center where you got this. They saw the fellow and said, well, we'll put you on the operating schedule at the end of the day tomorrow. And in the early hours of the morning, he had a rupture and a catastrophic life-threatening bleed. The one patient that died, he ruptured after the Humacyte graft was used inside of his abdomen to replace the iliac artery in a patient who had intestinal injuries and fecal soilage. And when he blew out, the surgeons opened his belly right in the room to try to control the hemorrhage before they took him back to the OR. And when he got him back to the OR, he died on the table of bleeding. And his postmortem clearly said by the pathologist, this guy died of the consequences of massive hemorrhage. You know, I don't have access to the charts anymore, but if memory serves me correct, there were 2 other patients where they opened their extremity wound right in the room because of this catastrophic bleeding.
So there were catastrophic bleeds even in the extremities.
Even in the extremities.
And this product was approved for use in extremities.
Yes, it was. It was approved for use in extremities when no vein is available.
Now, this information, you shared it with the other 2 vascular doctors, I'm assuming.
I shared it with the other 2 vascular doctors. And when our consults go across centers, our consults are always reviewed by our management. And my consult was reviewed by my management. My consult said, this thing needs to go to a panel. This data needs to be publicly vetted. There needs to be a public panel that engages vascular surgeons, trauma experts, military surgeons, surgical infection experts to understand why these catastrophic breakdowns are occurring. And I think about half of the breakdowns didn't occur at the anastomosis. Defects develop in the Humacyte graft itself, which is very disturbing.
Right.
A plastic artery is not going to develop a hole in it that's going to kill a patient.
Right.
And
You're
so-
saying that not when a graft fails, it'll fail at the attachment point where it was stitched. This was actually structurally failing in the center of the graft.
It failed both ways, but about 50-50. There were failures from holes that were found in the graft.
Right. That's tremendously scary.
Very scary.
Oh, so at that point, you wrote a report. Where is that report today?
Well, let me back up one step. My report was vetted by my managers, by Dr. Bram Zuckerman, the head of the Office of Cardiovascular Devices, and by my branch chief, Carmen Johnson. And 3 of my managers wrote an endorsement to my consultation that they submitted as part of the medical record. So in the CBER permanent files, there will be a summary document of mine that calls for this data to be vetted at a public panel meeting. There will be an endorsement sheet for my management in the Office of Cardiovascular Devices. 3 separate supervisors signed off and said, we agree with Dr. Lee. And there will also be a several 100-page document that are the 86 case reports that I put together on a case-by-case basis to identify the problems. That should be part of the permanent record.
So then walk me through the steps. How does this product, you get sign off on your superiors on your report? There are 86 patients that you're looking at. There are catastrophic failures with the device when it's implanted in the thorax or the abdomen and the extremities. And the device itself is failing, not just where it's stitched in, but actually in the mid-center of the device itself, about 50-50. So tell me the story. How does this product at this point go from that point to an FDA approval letter December of last year, December of 24. How does it get with no hearing? How does this product get no hearing? And who approves this product? And how do they justify that approval? Tell me about this.
How did it get there? Well, let me back up and we'll go back to the administrative changes that occurred with the reorganization. Now, normally when we approve devices or under the old supervisory management at CBER, after the files were reviewed by all the appropriate experts on the team, not just the clinicians, but the basic scientists, the manufacturing experts, the biologists, the sterility, the labeling experts, there would be a team meeting where everybody would talk about their perspective, and it would wind around the table, and it usually end up with you, the medical officer, to weigh in on, does this product have a favorable risk-benefit balance? And keep in mind that the threshold for devices, according to the Code of Federal Regulations, is that a device has to have a, quote, reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness. The burden of proof is higher for CBER with these novel biologic problems. And I believe, if my recollection of the language in the CFR is correct, it says they have to have a substantial level of evidence of safety and effectiveness. So after my consult was submitted and after my discussion with the CBER medical officers who knew my concerns, who shared my concerns, but who indicated to me that, we're getting a little pressure from above that this thing is going to get approved one way or another. There never was a team meeting held where I had the opportunity to tell the whole department and the management what our clinical concerns were from a vascular perspective. The only meeting I got invited to were 2 labeling meetings. And at the first one I stated, aren't we doing things backward here? Why are we talking about the labeling for this product if we haven't weighed in on the risk-benefit ratio? And I was told this is the way we do things now.
Okay,
So
let me question. You mentioned something, pressure from above. What does that mean to you? What did you interpret that as, that comment?
it means to me that my fellow CBER medical officers who told me, Bob, I share your concerns, were coming back to me with feedback saying, I'm getting pressure from my management that we have to find a way to get this thing.
And who would that,
approval.
who would typically could pressure CBER? Who's above them that could put
Well,
that?
no, this is pressure on the medical officers from their office director or their team leader. It was coming from the new middle management at CBER.
Okay, so new middle management at CBER, for whatever reason you're not sure, was putting pressure to approve this product despite the warnings that you were putting out there and that your direct managers had put out there. And did the other 2 vascular surgeons also share the same concerns as you?
Well, I put right in my consultation that I vetted the problematic cases with my fellow medical officers, and they're aligned with me on these serious concerns.
So all 3 of the vascular surgeons were aligned. All of your direct supervisors supported you. But when it came to CBER, instead of going the route of having an open hearing as the FDA is supposed to do, they went right to a label meeting to prepare a label, to prepare the product for approval to put out in the market. And you're saying, if I understand you correctly, you're saying, well, wait a second, we're putting the cart before the horse. You're talking about labeling a product that I'm telling you has catastrophic failure. I'm telling you this product, if you put it in our soldiers under battle conditions, our soldiers will die. I'm telling you that patients who had this product implanted died. Patients went into emergency failure, had to be opened up in their hospital bed because they couldn't make it to the operating room on time. And that the conditions of the Ukrainian soldiers would be different than the conditions of the Department of Defense US soldiers, because the Ukrainian soldiers aren't treated on the battlefield. They have to be brought back away from the action because the Russians are shooting at those battlefield hospitals. so that the American soldiers would arguably be treated in the battlefield. And if this product has never been tested really in the battlefield, yet the Department of Defense spent maybe $6 or $10 million helping this product get started. The shareholders of this company are probably out $200 or $300 million for this product. So there's a lot of pressure, I would imagine, for the company to make this product come to market and to be successful. And somehow that urgency and pressure, the economic pressure on the company, somehow got translated to the FDA. And the FDA is putting pressure on CBER to take this product and get a label and get it approved, even though 3 very seasoned, how many years of surgical experience between the 3 of you? Vascular surgical experience. How many years do you think the 3 of you have combined?
I mean, the military medical officer had 30. The academic surgeon like myself probably had 40 years. So well over 100 years of experience.
100 years of experience. And so what happens? You go to this, now you're at a meeting to do a label. You're still expressing your concerns. What happens next?
Well, again, I don't understand what the pressures were on CBER or what their drive was to approve this. But the first labeling meeting, I said, are we doing things, putting the horse before the cart? And I was just told, this is the way that we're doing things now. So that labeling meeting was really on technical issues like how to take the thing out of the packaging. Wasn't really much for me to weigh in on. But a week or so later at the next labeling meeting, the meeting opens with the CBER medical officer, who was the prime lead on the file, saying, well, we've got the solution right here. We'll put a black box warning that said hemorrhage can occur with this use of this device, and that will solve the problem. And I said, well, let me interject here. Having practiced on the streets of Detroit, when these people come in, they're an extremist. There's no way that an educated risk-benefit discussion can be held. I think one of the CBER managers piped in at that point, and these were remote meetings on Zoom, so I don't know who said what, but somebody said, oh yeah, the surgeon will be forced to have a detailed conversation with the patients before they use this thing. And I said, it doesn't work that way. These people come in hypotensive, bleeding to death, your finger's in the hole or your fist is in the hole, trying to tamponade the injury. And the only preoperative discussion you have with the patient is to say, sir, you've got a very serious life and limb-threatening problem. We need to go to the operating room ASAP. And all I can promise you is I will do my humanly best to save your life and your leg. This black box does not permit the surgeon enough time to have an educated discussion with patients about a problem with this risk-benefit profile. Nor can a surgeon, at the time he implants an artificial device, whether it's lab-grown or man-made, at the time of trauma, he doesn't have the foresight to predict who that graft is going to get infected with. And I believe one of the mechanisms of action is under the action of bacterial enzymes, this product is capable of melting away. So that black box warning doesn't mitigate the risk to the patient once the surgeon makes a decision to put it in.
Does the black box warning contain any information about catastrophic failure or about, as you just said, the body's own enzymes could make this graft melt away? Is that mentioned anywhere in the warning?
No, the linkage between the failure modes is not there. And for exactness sake, let me bring up the black box warning, and I'll read it verbatim because I think that is important here. The black box warning says this: warning, graft failure. See full prescribing information for complete box warning. Loss of CIMVAS integrity due to mid-graft rupture or anastomotic failure can result in life-threatening hemorrhage. That's what it says. I don't think a layperson is capable of understanding, those implications. And nor did the labeling go far enough. It should have said something like, you could die immediately. And if this happens, you need to have somebody put a tourniquet on you ASAP because you might not survive long enough for EMS to get there and get you to the hospital. The warnings do not protect the patient from the hazards. They transfer the onus onto the surgeon, for crying out loud.
Now, let me ask you a question. You told me that at one point, the FDA did not evaluate or base this black box warning on all 86 patients. They had pared that back to about approximately 50 patients.
Well, the effectiveness data was based for the trauma indication was based on the 51 patients. But if you look in a more detailed document that most physicians don't know exists, called the Summary Basis for Regulatory Action, they're clear that there were 7 disruptions of continuity that occurred in the U.S. trauma population. And there was one case that occurred in the Ukraine where the HAV blew out 3 times. They went in there 3 times to try to patch it, repair it, before they finally took it out and replaced it with the patient's own vein, if memory serves me correct. So the graft warning is derived on the full safety information from the 86 subjects. And that's where you get 8 out of 86 is a 9.3%, a catastrophic graft failure.
Is there anything in the black box warning that says there's a 9% chance of catastrophic failure?
In the labeling, I think it labels it or specifies it out as about a 7% risk or something in the extremity group. But if a person delves deeply into this document, which is on the CBER website and very few practicing physicians know about, you will find a document called the Summary Basis for Regulatory Action that gives you the rates, but it doesn't give you the clinical context of the cases in which this occurred, nor does the labeling tell you how catastrophic these events were. And that's why I believe the totality of the sponsor's clinical data needs to be made available to the Defense Department. So what I read, the military surgeons can read and understand how this thing failed.
Do you think
that information belongs vetted at a public panel where every civilian vascular trauma surgeon that would use this product knows in granular detail what happened to the affected patients and how it failed?
There seems to be a fear of transparency here. Why do you think the FDA took a route that is not transparent here? Why did the FDA not simply have a hearing on this?
I can't answer that question, but to go back to the second meeting where we talked about this, the medical officer was told by one of his managers, let's leave this discussion on the black box and we'll continue on a little bit further. And then the discussion came to about the failure modes. And I made the point that, look, this thing fails dramatically different from a PTFE graft. You can't be assured that because infections and disruptions occur with PTFE, that it's going to be the same with this graft. And again, I was met with a voice that somebody else told me after the fact was one of the CBER managers. And she again tells the medical officer, we're done debating this point. Let's move on with this.
So she shut you down, this person?
She shut me down.
Who was that person, please?
I prefer to name names when I'm testifying in front of the Senate.
That's fair enough.
You can look at who signed the approval letters for the supervisors. You can look at the summary document, basis of regulatory action summary document, and see who was involved. But I was shut down. And so I may have made a politically incorrect rhetorical question when I asked, I don't understand why you asked me to spend hundreds of hours plodding through 2,300 pages of detailed clinical information, and you're not interested in what I have to say about this from the perspective of a vascular surgeon.
Well, let's take it to the next step, because you told me something else beyond this that was fascinating. You said that the FDA, after they realized that they were getting pushback from the 3 vascular surgeons that you've been talking about, you and the other 2 doctors, went outside the agency or to go to FDA consulting vascular surgeons. So they went to 3 other surgeons. They weren't getting what they wanted from you, buy-in from you. So they went to 3 other surgeons, and they mentioned that in a letter. That was the FDA letter. I believe it was on page 16 of the FDA letter we talked about.
Well, I believe that's referenced to in both the approval letter
Okay.
as well as the summary document of regulatory action.
Do they mention the names of those 3 outside consultants?
No, they do not. They just said that. And actually, let me get that language out, because
that letter left the impression that those 3 outside consultants approved this product.
I think, it's very important to look at the language in that letter directly. So if you bear with me for a second, I'll bring it up and read it directly. Yeah, it's on page 2 of the approval letter of December 19th. And there's a subsection at the top of page 2 that says Advisory Committee. Quote, "We did not refer your application to the Cellular, Tissue, and Gene Therapies Advisory Committee because our review of information submitted in your BLA, including the clinical study and trial results, did not raise concerns or controversial issues that would have benefited from an advisory committee discussion."
Is that
That's
a true
an
statement?
out-and-out lie. That's an out-and-out lie. There was concern from the 3 vascular surgeon medical officers. There was concern by my management. And as I tell the rest of the story, there was concerns from the upper echelon of the Center for Devices Management that took our concerns directly to the head of the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research and brought our concerns to the top of the CBER command chain. And our concerns were ignored.
Now, do you think that a hearing was warranted under the conditions you're telling me?
Absolutely. If you go to the federal regulations, and the CFR is written to give medical device companies the benefit of the doubt, in my opinion, it doesn't say that advisory committee meeting is mandatory, but it lays out certain conditions when it should be considered, such as A, for new biologic products, B, for controversial products, C, when clinical study results raise significant concerns about safety. This particular file, out of any one of the 1,400 files that I consulted on during my 10 years at FDA, checked all the boxes as to why you needed an advisory committee meeting. And if this was a device, this product would have never got to market without coming to a public advisory committee where the data was vetted so that everybody who might want to use the product knew the full details, so that patients were aware of the risk. Why they put the kibosh on it, I think you have to take that question to the top of CBER. But let me go back and finish telling the story, because after I made that comment at the second labeling meeting, the next day I received a call from my boss saying, "Well, you've been accused of disruptive behavior because of what you said at the meeting yesterday." I said, you know me, there's only one thing that will get my ire up, and that's when patient safety is being subjugated to some other concerns. And I brought it to the attention of my manager, and she brought it to the attention of her managers, the gravity of this particular file. Now, from that point on, we weren't asked to have any input into the approval. We weren't asked to have any input into the labeling, which I believe is deficient. CBER went on and made their own decision to approve this. But I wasn't content to let things rest there. I said, my management raised this with CBER, and they were blown off. Their requests were ignored. Well, there was a change in the Center for Devices and Radiologic Health in July, where the former center director, Jeff Shuren, resigned, and a new director, Michelle Tarver, took over. And as a result of me talking to the ombudsman from the Center of Biology and the Center for Devices, she became aware that I was elevating this concern up the hierarchy of FDA. I even went to the chief medical officer in the commissioner's office, and she blew me off and said, you need to talk to the head of the combination products branch. And if you elevate this to my level, that you're going to undergo scrutiny by your own managers. I said, I don't care. They already know how I feel about this. And I've already decided to retire because I don't want to be part of an organization that subjugates patient safety to whatever reason. But as a result of me elevating it up the chain and making sure that Peter Marks knew about our concerns, Michelle Tarver, the new head of the Center for Devices, called me shortly after she assumed office. And I knew her well from working on other projects with her, that she's a serious lady, that she's got a probative mind, and that she asks the right questions. She said, Bob, tell me the story. And I told her the story as outlined here. The next day, I got a call from my boss, my team lead, and she said, Bob, I want to let you know there was a high-level meeting held between our center management and the Center for Biology Evaluation and Research, and they promised that we're going to have a panel meeting about this. I said, thank you so much. That's all I wanted to see. That's all I was asking for, is that this problematic file be properly vetted in public by the appropriate experts. And I was satisfied with that. That's what I wanted. Well, as you can read in the CBER Basis for Regulatory Action document and in the approval letter, for whatever reason, Peter Marks changed his mind and there was not a panel meeting held. They went out and they gave the records, and I don't believe they gave all of the records, but they gave certain records that they wanted 3 outside government employed physicians who did not work for FDA to have, and asked these 3 anonymous surgeons to weigh in on things.
Now, you said they didn't give them all the records. Which records did they hold back?
I don't know, but again, if you look at the phraseology that's in the summary document on the Basis for Regulatory Action, it just says these 3 surgeons were asked to weigh in on certain elements of the file.
Okay.
So I don't believe they gave them all 2,300 pages.
And something interesting happened to you subsequent to you leaving the FDA. You were at a vascular surgery meeting recently, correct?
I was sitting at a dinner meeting with some of my vascular surgical.
When was this, please?
In the middle of February, early February.
And what meeting was that?
It was a Michigan Vascular Society meeting.
Okay.
Which is our regional vascular society in the state.
Tell us what happened. Somebody walked up to you and had a conversation.
Oh, I was sitting at dinner with a couple surgeons, and one of them said, how are you enjoying retirement? And I said, good. And a fellow sitting next to him said, well, Bob, you got to tell me, how did that device get approved? I said, well, what do you know about it? And he said, well, I'm one of the 3 surgeons that was asked to vet the thing, and I had concerns about it. I said, wow. I said, were you given access to 2,300 pages of detailed granular information where you could read patient by patient what happened to these individuals who got the CIMVAS graft? And I was told, no, I did not. So at that point in time, when I realized the system was rigged and that it was not only the 3 FDA employed vascular surgeons that had concern about this, but another respected academic surgeon who told me he was concerned about it, I said, I have to come forward. This is not right. And the other thing that the surgeon pointed out to me, uh, he said, "Bob, look at the article that was published in JAMA Surgery a month or two ago by the Humacyte investigators and a couple of the Humacyte principals. Look at that article. It doesn't mention some of the things that occurred catastrophically to these patients." So I acted to ensure that the totality of information about this product gets publicly vetted so that an educated decision can be made by physicians and patients alike, particularly military surgeons. I don't want to see our wounded warriors hurt by a product that might not make it back from the battlefield in the Orient to Walter Reed Hospital before it loses continuity and that soldier's life is threatened.
Let's talk about Humacyte for a second. You had another interesting conversation, and to what extent you can share it with me. You actually spoke to the former CEO of Humacyte, who himself is a vascular surgeon, correct? He was the former CEO of the company.
He was a former CEO, and he served in several capacities as like their chief surgical officer. He was a renowned academic surgeon who did a lot of the preliminary work on this in the animal lab, and also on the company's behalf went around to their clinical sites supervising the clinical use of the product.
And this was before they became a public company, correct?
Yes, this was before he became a public company. After it became a public company, when the venture capitalists took it public via Special Purpose Acquisition Corporation, this surgeon announced that he was leaving the company. And I thought, wow, this guy has been the most ardent advocate at the meetings. He's a well-respected surgeon scientist, and he's leaving the company. And he actually called me to say, "Bob, you think there's a place for me at the FDA?" And I said, "I believe that you're exactly what the Center for Biology needs, a surgeon scientist who has a PhD in cell biology."
Why would he leave a company just when it's going into public sphere? Why would he leave a company at that point? What did he say to you?
I think, he has to be asked that question directly, but basically he said, "Bob, you know me. I've always been honest and forthright, and I just don't want to be in a position where I might not be able to speak my mind."
What does that mean? Can you expand on that a little bit?
Uh, I mean, again, I think he's more concerned about his professional reputation, and he didn't want to stay in a situation where it could have been damaged. But again, I think he's the best one to answer that question directly. But I did tell him, you're exactly what CBER needs. You're a surgeon, you have a PhD in cell biology. Obviously, you couldn't work on their products. I said, "Would you want me to write a letter of recommendation for you over there?" And he told me, "No, I don't need to do that because my Duke basketball tickets are with the FDA. I sit right next to Rob Califf, the FDA Commissioner. So by virtue of his Duke connection, he knew Rob Califf."
Okay. So we don't know. Humacyte knows all of this. We would assume it's their study, they're their patients. So they know all of this.
They have to know. The interesting thing, again, is if you go to that article that was printed in JAMA Surgery a couple months back, underneath all the list of authors, it says these two people from Humacyte are the only people who had access to the totality of the data. So whether those other authors on that paper knew about these patients, they put their name on a paper which tells an incomplete story about the catastrophe. But that article is clear that two of the Humacyte principals were the ones that had total access to all the study information that was reported in this article in a major peer-reviewed journal.
Do you think, if you could speak directly to the Secretary of Defense, who's funding this and who is going to be, his organization is going to be the major purchaser of this product. This is a trauma graft. First off, do you think the Department of Defense is aware of these catastrophic problems that were seemingly covered up at the FDA? Was anybody at DOD in any of these meetings?
They were not in the review meetings. They participated in meetings over the years where they made it known to CBER that, we consider this a priority product. We would like to have it for our wounded warriors. But I think they were given the impression, based on how the company, promoted the product, that they were going to end up with a durable, infection-resistant, thrombosis-resistant vascular conduit. And the reality is that the clinical data does not bear that the performance of the HAV in its current state is what the Defense Department wanted or need. I don't believe they probably had access to the totality of the data. The law states that anything a sponsor submits to FDA in terms of the detailed clinical data, et cetera, is considered confidential proprietary information. But Peter Hegseth should demand, I want to see the same granular information that Dr. Lee saw, because we paid for that study with at least $4 million of taxpayers' money. And I don't want my military surgeons using it until they have seen the totality of the data. I believe he's a conscientious man. He stands up for the guys in uniform, and he's not going to want to see soldiers hurt by a product that had a disruption rate of approaching 10%.
Now, if you could speak.
Right now we're 51. Question.
I'll be done in 5 minutes. All right. I'm wrapping up now. Okay, Bob, you ready?
Yes, sir.
Okay. If you could speak to Dr. Makary, Marty Makary, who's going to be the new commissioner of the FDA. Dr. Makary, when he was in the Senate subcommittee testifying, made a commitment to the open hearing process at the FDA, that he would have open hearings about controversial products and topics. They didn't mention specifically the Humacyte graft. They were talking about other things. But if you could speak directly to the new commissioner of the FDA, what would you request from him? What should he do here to fix this, to protect our troops? What should he be doing?
Dr. Makary, you were very clear in your congressional hearings that you were willing to open up certain controversial items within the FDA to panel meetings. And this falls into that area where there's a dire need for a panel meeting. Besides vetting this problem, I think you need to take a deep look at how the Center for Biology and Evaluation Research operates, because it's not a healthy environment when medical officers are under the gun to approve a product against their good judgment. And that was one commitment that Michelle Tarver made to me when I talked to her. She goes, you can rest assured, as long as I'm in charge of the Center for Devices, that our medical officers aren't going to be subject to that type of pressure.
Some straightforward questions, and then we'll wrap this up. Should the Humacyte CIMVAS vascular graft have been approved the way it is?
I don't believe it should have been approved without the benefit of a public panel meeting.
Is the CIMVAS vascular graft the way it is dangerous, and will it kill our troops if it's implanted in battlefield conditions?
Based on the adverse events observed in the clinical study, it's a dangerous problem that poses a threat to both our wounded warriors and our civilian patients who get this product. And I don't believe that risk can be effectively mitigated by the current product labeling.
And the remedy here would be for the FDA to recall this product or to rescind the approval, send this to open hearings where people like you and the other vascular surgeons, and from my count, there's a total of 4 of you that we know about who have serious reservations about this product. There should be an open hearing about it. The Department of Defense should be in attendance at those hearings with their physicians and their scientific people so they can make a determination as to whether or not this product should be placed in a soldier's body, correct?
Correct. And the information should be publicly vetted to any surgeon. It shouldn't just be me. I mean, by reviewing those cases, I would have learned a lot of when I might or might not have wanted to use this case as a surgeon. And surgeons should have that information to make educated judgments about this problem.
And I
Not
believe,
get it from the product labeling.
that Robert Kennedy Jr. also made statements as to improving and remaking the FDA. And Dr. Makary is committed to the hearing process and bringing trust, the public trust, building the public trust back in the FDA. And I realize that the industry has criticized the FDA for taking too long to approve needed products, which is the other side of the argument, that the industry that makes grafts and medical devices says, we're making great things and the FDA is holding them back from the market. But in this case, this product got pushed through without a hearing over the objection of no less than 4 vascular surgeons with approximately 120 years of experience. It was given an approval letter. The Department of Defense is not aware, never saw the granular data here, and are about to put this in soldiers all around the globe. And there's a chance, a very high chance, and you're saying almost a 9 to 10% chance that these grafts will have catastrophic failure, resulting in death of soldiers. And that's what you're trying to stop. Isn't that what we're doing here?
Yeah, I mean, transparency is essential to the public trusting the government. And this product was not vetted in a transparent process. And hopefully there'll be congressional hearings that look into how a product got approved in a less than transparent process in a manner that endangers patients' lives.
Well, thank you. We're at the end of this, and I just want to say thank you very much. And I look forward to working with you on this until this problem gets fixed. And God willing, this product will not be placed in any soldiers until it's properly vetted and approved in public hearings with full knowledge and disclosure to the Department of Defense. And we ask the Secretary of Defense and we ask the new chairman of the FDA to pay attention to this. People's lives are on the line. Soldiers' lives are on the line. And men of good conscience like yourself are brave enough to come forward and tell the story. And I want to thank you for that.
Well,
So
thank you, Joe.
Thank you. And we'll be speaking again.
God bless America and God protect our troops.
God bless. Thank you.